At 6:11 a.m. on July 27th, 1945, a tractor sat silent in a field of gold. The war in Europe was over. The radios said so. The papers said so. But for one farmer in central Texas, the battle wasn't finished just because the guns had gone quiet overseas. His enemy that morning wasn't a German soldier or a Japanese sniper. It was a dead engine. The man was Thomas Reed, 47 years old, shoulders bent by more than just age. 6 years of drought had baked the land. Rationing had thinned the pantry. Nights had been spent staring at the kitchen table, waiting for letters from sons fighting half a world away. One was in France, one was somewhere in the Pacific. Every knock on the door made his heart stop. Now his John Deere Model B refused to start. He'd been wrestling with it for 2 days. The wheat around him stood at its peak, ripe and ready, 2 days away from over-ripening and shattering in the wind. On the horizon, black clouds were crawling in, slow but sure, like a second front rolling toward him. If he lost this harvest, he wouldn't just lose income. He'd lose the farm that had carried the Reed name through dust storms and depression. Working beside him were 12 men in faded khaki uniforms, each stenciled with 2 stark black letters. PW. Prisoner of war. They were Germans, captured in Tunisia 2 years earlier, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through camps in Oklahoma, then sent out in trucks to places like this, to Texas fields, where American hands had gone off to fight. They bent their backs under the same sun as Reed, but a barbed wire fence and a different language kept them apart. Behind the fence line, a guard leaned on his rifle, already sweating in the morning heat, cap tilted back, boredom in his eyes. The prisoners spoke little. They had learned that silence was the safest uniform they could wear. One of them, a thin mechanic named Carl Weber, crouched near the tractor's wheel hub, watching. He was 27, from Stuttgart, once employed in a Daimler factory building aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. His hands still remembered the weight of wrenches, the rhythm of pistons. Now those same hands hauled sacks of grain in a country that called him the enemy. Reed slammed the hood shut, muttering a curse that crossed any language barrier. The guard smirked. Carl hesitated, then stepped forward, swallowing his pride and his fear. "Sir," he said carefully, his accent thick, "I can fix." Reed straightened, half amused, half angry that this scrawny German thought he knew more about a Texas tractor than he did. "You can fix this?" he asked, wiping grease on his trousers. Carl nodded once. "Engines are same, anywhere," he replied, choosing each word like it might explode if dropped wrong. For a long second, Reed just studied him. The man was thin but steady, eyes calm in a way Reed had only seen in people who'd already survived their worst day. Finally, Reed jerked his chin toward the tractor. "Fine, but if you break it worse, you'll be pulling that plow yourself." A faint smile flickered across Carl's face and vanished. He stepped to the machine and lifted the hood again. The air underneath was thick with gasoline and dust. He moved by habit, not rush, tracing wires, touching metal, listening with his fingertips. The ignition wire was cracked, the magneto coil fractured, the kind of failure that needed parts no one had. In 1945, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war. Nearly 50,000 of them lived in Texas alone. Their camps dotted the countryside from Hearne to Hereford, from Camp Bowie near Brownwood to tiny branch compounds tucked behind cotton fields and windbreaks. They lived under the rules of the Geneva Convention, decent food, medical care, even 80 cents a day in scrip. On paper, it was humane. In town gossip, it was madness. Locals saw murderers, fanatics, the same uniforms they'd seen in newsreels of burning Europe. Others saw something simpler. Free labor when every able-bodied American was wearing olive drab. As months passed, the edges of fear wore down into curiosity. Farmers discovered that many of the men swinging scythes and stacking bales had once been bakers, teachers, mechanics men drafted, defeated, and stranded halfway across the world. Now, one of them stood over Thomas Reed's silent tractor, thinking. Carl looked from the broken coil to the fence line. "Need wire," he said. "Metal wire." Reed frowned. "For what?" Carl pointed toward the barbed wire fence. That will do. The guard barked a laugh. He wants to fix a tractor with barbed wire. But Reed didn't join in. Something in Carl's steady tone made him pause. Let him try, Reed said. Carl borrowed a pair of pliers, stripped back the brittle insulation, and cut a short length of wire. He wrapped it around the broken coil, twisting it tight until it sang like a tense string. From the barn wall he pulled a nail, ground it against a stone step until it shone, then slid it into the coil as a makeshift contact point. His movements were careful, almost delicate, like a watchmaker coaxing life back into springs that didn't want to move. Sweat ran down his neck, soaking the faded cloth of his uniform. At 6:47, he stepped back and nodded. Try now. Reed gripped the crank. One pull, nothing. Second pull, a cough. A puff of black smoke. Third pull, the engine caught, sputtered, then roared into life, rattling the very air. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the guard let out a shout. The prisoners cheered, grinning despite themselves. Reed just stared, speechless. The machine that had defied him for 2 days now idled smoothly, held together by scrap metal and the hands of a man the world had taught him to hate. That evening, when the sun slid down behind the windbreak and the field lay shaved and stubbled, Reed did something no regulation manual had ever imagined. He walked over to the guard, hesitated, then said, "Sergeant, how about the men eat up at the house tonight?" End quote. The guard squinted at him, thrown off balance. "They're fed at camp, sir. Rules are." "Yeah, I know the rules," Reed cut in, voice quiet but firm. "I'm asking anyway." The sergeant studied him a moment, then shrugged. "Your risk, sir." He slung his rifle and motioned to the prisoners. The men exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Being marched at dusk could mean anything in a war that was ending in pieces. Inside the farmhouse, the table was long and plain, scarred by years of meals and worries. Mrs. Reed had laid out cornbread, beans, boiled potatoes, and strong coffee that could probably strip paint. She wiped her hands on her apron as the Germans filed in, hats twisting in nervous fingers. They sat stiffly on the edges of their chairs, unsure where to place their eyes, unsure how to behave in the kitchen of a man whose sons might be fighting theirs. For a while, only the clink of utensils and the murmur of grace broke the air. Reed cleared his throat. "War's about over," he said, more to the room than to anyone in particular. "My oldest wrote from France, says he's seen enough mud to last him several lifetimes. My youngest—" He paused, jaw tightening. "He's still listed as missing in the Philippines." The words hung there. Carl looked up from his plate. "I am sorry," he said softly. His own voice surprised him. He spoke then, haltingly, about Stuttgart. About nights when the air raid sirens wailed and the sky turned red. How the factory where he'd worked had vanished in a single raid. He did not mention the bodies pulled from cellars. He didn't need to. The silence filled in the missing details. At one point, Reed's little boy toddled in, clutching a battered toy truck with one wheel loose. He walked straight toward the stranger with the odd accent. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Carl blinked, then let out a quiet laugh. "I can try." He turned the toy in his hands, tightened the axle with a nail and a twist, the way he had in the barn that morning. The truck rolled straight when the boy pushed it across the floor, and a ripple of lightness moved through the room. Outside, thunder rolled over the plains, and rain finally marched across the land in gray sheets. But the wheat was cut, the last wagons already under cover. The season was saved. By dawn, the tractor started on the first pull, as if it had never been stubborn at all. Word spread through the camp like wind through tall grass. The German who fixed the American's farm. Guards joked about signing him up for the Army Corps of Engineers. The other prisoners teased him, bowing low and calling him Herr John Deere. Carl only shook his head and smiled faintly. Inside, a different kind of repair had begun, small, fragile, but real. 2 months later, the war felt closer to done. Newspapers spoke of surrender terms and tribunals, of soldiers coming home in waves. Trucks rolled up to the camp each week, hauling away rows of men and their canvas duffel bags. One morning, Carl's name appeared on a faded clipboard. Transport 217. Destination, New York, then Germany. On his last day at the farm, Carl rose before sunrise. The tractor was already waiting, metal cold in the dim light. He moved through the barn like a ghost, oiling hinges, straightening tools, tightening bolts on wagons he knew he would never see again. It was useless work, maybe, but it felt like a way to say goodbye in a language he understood. Reed's pickup rattled into the yard. The farmer climbed out, hat in his hands. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Reed stepped forward and offered his hand. They shook, firm and silent, skin roughened by different continents but the same kind of work. Reed reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small photograph his family lined up beside the John Deere. Field golden behind them, sky wide and empty. He held it out. "If you ever make it back," he said, eyes steady, "there'll be work waitin'." Carl looked at the picture as though it weighed more than paper. "For a long time, thank you," he replied, "for letting me feel useful again." 31 days later, his ship slid into Bremerhaven. From the deck, the shoreline looked like the surface of the moon, cranes frozen over shattered docks, warehouses blown open like empty shells. As Carl walked inland, he saw children scavenging for bits of coal, women queuing silently for bread, men staring at ruins where streets used to be. Stuttgart was worse. The city he remembered as a lattice of tram lines and brick facades had been flattened into a landscape of chimneys and broken walls. The Daimler factory where he'd once listened to engines sing was now a twisted skeleton of steel. His parents' apartment block was simply gone, replaced by a crater and a few crooked door frames. Neighbors told him, quietly, that they hadn't survived the bombing of March 1944. For a time, Carl drifted, but the world still needed things to move, to turn, to start. He found work first repairing bicycles, then tractors dragged in from rural towns, their owners desperate to coax one more season out of battered machines. Slowly he rented a small workshop and painted his name above the door, Weber, Maschinen Service. On one wall, he hammered a nail and hung a single photograph, the reeds, the tractor, and the open Texas sky. When customers pointed at it and asked, he would just shrug and say, "A friend. He taught me how to fix things properly." In May 1947, far away in Texas, a brown envelope arrived at the Reed farm. Inside was a short letter, written in careful, slanting English. "Dear Mr. Reed, I hope the harvest was good this year. I am home. Germany is broken but alive. When I fix engines, I still hear Texas wind. Thank you for the day you trusted me. Carl Weber." Mrs. Reed framed the letter and set it on the mantel. Over the years, the ink would fade, but the weight of the words never did. Decades slipped by, one harvest after another. Camp Bowie was torn down, its barracks replaced by neat rows of houses and paved streets where children rode bicycles, unaware that enemy soldiers had once walked that same ground under guard. The stories of German POWs working Texas fields faded into the background hum of local history, half-remembered tales told on porches at dusk. But in barns and tool sheds across the state, their fingerprints remained. Tractors rebuilt by German hands still turned over on cold mornings with a reliability that made old-timers shake their heads. "Some kraut fixed that one back in '44, they'd say, patting a fender. No one remembered the names, only the work. In 1984, a journalist from Dallas decided those stories were worth more than a passing remark. Researching POW camps, he followed a trail of veterans, yellowed documents, and rumors that led him to a weathered farm outside Brownwood. There he found Thomas Reed Jr., now an old man with hands as rough as his father's had been, and eyes that still measured everything like a ledger. When the reporter asked about the German mechanic, Reed Jr. only smiled and motioned him toward the barn. The wood groaned as he pulled the doors open. Inside, under a haze of dust motes and the faint smell of oil, sat the same John Deere tractor. Its paint was faded to a tired green, but the coil still bore the strange, neat twist of wire that had been wrapped there almost 40 years earlier. Reed Jr. gripped the crank and gave it a pull. The engine coughed, sputtered, then settled into a steady, familiar rumble. He patted the hood with affection. "Still works," he said quietly. Guess he fixed more than just metal that day. Across Texas, some of the former prisoners never went back to Germany. A few returned as immigrants, married local women, opened bakeries, garages, small stores. Their children grew up saying y'all with a Texas drawl and listening to grandparents who rolled their R's like the Rhine. Others, like Carl, never crossed the ocean again. Carl Weber died in 1972, buried in Stuttgart, not far from the streets he'd once known as rubble. When his nephew cleared out the workshop, he found the same Texas photograph still hanging above the workbench, edges curled, colors sun-faded. On the back, in careful German, Carl had written 5 words. Frieden beginnt mit Vertrauen. Peace begins with trust. If you stand in a quiet Texas field on a still morning, you might hear only the distant buzz of an engine and the wind through the stubble. But somewhere in that sound lingers the echo of a day when an enemy reached for a wrench, a farmer reached for trust, and, for a brief moment, the world turned in a different direction.